All right, everybody, it's 8 a.m. It's Thursday morning. Welcome. My name is Sam Saad, and today we are talking about closing costs and title under the FARBAR and NABOR contracts. A little bit of who pays for what. So I'm an attorney here in Southwest Florida. Because I am an attorney, we're going to start with my disclaimer. You've seen many times, but this information is for informational purposes only. We do not have an attorney-client relationship. And if you have any specific questions, you can reply to me offline and we'll get a relationship started. Just a little bit about me, of course. I am a past chair and scribe of the NABOR Legal Resources Committee. So when you say who writes this stuff, that's me. I'm a member of the FARBAR Joint Drafting Committee, so I'm very familiar, of course, with the FARBAR contracts as well. And we have offices throughout Southwest Florida where you can get all manner of business, real estate, estate planning, probate, and litigation services at a very reasonable rate. For closing services, we have a title company, Paradise Coast Title and Escrow, and we guarantee will be the lowest closing fee. I want to mention our security. We are about to launch Qualia Connect, which is very top-notch security in terms of the portal for your customers. And if you have any questions about Paradise Coast Title, you can reach out to me anytime at 239-784-5556. So today we're talking about closing costs. And we need to understand right up front to get started what form you use matters. Uh, they allocate closing costs differently, the FARBAR and the NABOR contracts. They just designate who is the closing agent differently. And it's typical that the county where the property is located is the customary way to denote who pays for closing costs. But just remember that it's always negotiable. In any county, Collier, Lee, Charlotte, wherever you're located, in any county, we can negotiate the closing costs and decide who pays for what on each of the different categories that we're going to talk about today. So, just a quick thought about the title charges. Um, the NABOR contract is an interesting animal in that the buyer always picks the closing agent regardless of the location of the property. And in the NABOR contract, the buyer pays for title in Collier County, the seller pays for title in Lien and Charlotte counties, and it does not address any of the other counties in the state of Florida. The FARBAR contract has checkboxes for who picks and pays for title, and whoever picks the title agent to pay for title charge pays for title charges, picks the closing agent. So I've got some contract snippets we're going to go through. In terms of expenses, like I said, the seller pays for title in Lee and Charlotte County on the NABOR contract. The seller pays for all the paperwork to transfer title. That's the deed, the estoppels, the bill of sale, things like that have to be taken care of. The broker compensation verifications, any tenant estoppel letters, any affidavits, FERPTA, all is paid for by the seller. The seller pays the documentary stamp taxes on the deed. This is the most expensive typical title cost as the doc stamps, and you'll often see this gets negotiated back and forth. Buyer or seller pays the doc stamps. A lot of people like to switch where the seller pays for title and the buyer pays the doc stamps. The doc stamps are always more than the title just because of the way the math works out. Doc stamps is 70 cents per $100 of value of the purchase price, whereas the title charges are going to be a little less than 50 cents per $100 of value on the purchase price. And that goes down depending on how high the purchase price gets. The seller has to pay for all the association documents. This is a big deal these days. I want to highlight this for everyone to make sure you see this. All seller pays all current association and property management costs, gets the forms, and any statutorily required documents paid for by the seller. on the NABOR contract. So make sure you're aware of that. That's a affirmative obligation of the seller. As far as buyer expenses go on the NABOR contract, the buyer pays for title in Collier County. The buyer pays for all lender title expenses. So whatever the lender fees are, whatever the title insurance premium is for the lender's policy, anything special the lender requires, the buyer pays for that. And the buyer pays for the recording fees. So the buyer pays the $10 for the first page plus $8.50 for each additional page of recording the deed, which is 2 or 3 pages, the mortgage, which could be anywhere from 10 to 20 pages, any riders to the mortgage if it's a second home, if there's a trust or anything like that. All are paid for. And Michael Ork, you're correct. Buyer pays doc stamps on the loan and the intangibles tax on the note. That's right. And the buyer pays for all association transfer and membership fees. So that's to your homeowner association, your condo association, your capital contributions, transfer fees, things like that are all paid by the buyer. The buyer pays for lien searches. So lien search is different than a title search. The buyer pays for the title search as well in Collier County, and the seller pays in Lee County. But the buyer always pays for the lien search on the NABOR contract. And remember, the lien search shows you open permits, unpaid utilities, things like that. The buyer pays any submerged land lease fees. So for those of you that might be doing a boat dock or a property that comes with a boat dock where it's out over the water, there may be submerged land lease, a submerged land lease with the state of Florida involved, and there's a 6% sales tax on that. So those are the NABOR expenses, how they divvy them up. FARBAR, of course, does it a little differently. They've split it up as these are the seller expenses under FARBAR. You'll see that the seller pays the doc stamps on the deed, same as NABOR. They pay the owner's policy and charges if paragraph 9C1 is checked. I'm going to show you paragraph 9C1 in a couple of slides. That's the seller pays for title. The title search charges, the municipal lien search charge, the FERPTA charges, HOA estoppel fee, and then the seller's closing services. See this right here? I'm highlighting here. Seller's closing service. What are seller's closing services? Well, closing services is a statutorily prescribed term that means any services performed by the title company, including document preparation, conducting the closing, handling and dispersing funds related to the closing, anything that's related to the title insurance being issued, the seller pays for seller's closing services. As well as on the FARBAR contract, the seller pays up to 125% of the estimated costs if the property is not maintained as is as of the effective date. So in terms of the buyer costs, if I get my slide to switch, in terms of the buyer costs under FARBAR, again, the buyer pays for those buyer closing services. That's preparing the documents for the buyer, whatever's required. What this essentially means is that in counties where the seller picks the title agent, the buyer can still be charged a closing fee if we do work for the buyer. Although there's not much work to be done for the buyer under the FARBAR contract when the seller pays for title. So there's a little tidbit for you. Negotiate your closing fee on the buyer side in FARBAR when the seller pays for title. But the buyer pays for taxes and recording fees on the notes and mortgage. They pay to record the deed. They pay for the owner's policy and charges if 9C2 is checked. I'll show you that again on the next slide. The buyer pays for the survey, the lender's title policy, the application transfer fees to the association. They pay for a lien search if they're paying for title. And then all the other fees, attorney's fees, appraisal fees, and loan expenses are all buyer's charges under FARBAR. And Joe, there are doc stamps on the note and mortgage, but not on the deed when you refinance. So FARBAR has a different choice. NABOR just tells you that you will, buyer, pick the title company, and seller, you will pay in Charlotte and Lee counties, and buyer, you will pay in Collier County. FARBAR takes a different approach. FARBAR says you can pick in any county. Then you check the box here. You can highlight here, or if you're in Miami, there's a third choice. But the seller shall designate the closing agent, or the buyer shall designate the closing agent, and then whoever picks pays for title. And then in Miami, they have this special provision where the buyer designates the closing agent and pays for the title policy, but the seller has to pay for the search and the tax search and the municipal lien search. So very interesting. Michael is asking, from a straight dollar and cents perspective, is there an advantage to one side paying fees? Michael, typically the seller's doc stamp charge is the most expensive, and that's what they like to negotiate. So everything I'm talking about here is negotiable today. Everything is, the closing costs can be allocated between the parties however you want. As a realtor, the you should not be modifying the pre-approved standard form. But if your customer says, you know what, I want the buyer to pay doc stamps, or I want the seller to pay title in Collier County, you could write that into the contract, and then you would just have me look at it and make sure that the language is correct. You're asking, isn't the buyer concerned with the net and the buyer concerned with the gross of the offer, regardless of how the contract reads? Yes. Michael, you make a great point in your second question. Buyers care about two things. How much do I have to bring to closing? What's my monthly cost? The closing costs, the down payment, all those things get rolled into how much do I bring to closing. And that's really what buyers care about when they're talking to me in the process. So I want to switch over. We talked about expenses. Let's talk about the survey for a minute. Buyer always pays for the survey if they need a new one, and the seller has to fix survey defects at the seller's expense. Just remember, I said this on a previous presentation during this series, the survey is so important. It tells you where the property is on the earth relative to the deed. The deed does not contain a property address. You can't find the property from the legal description unless you really know what you're doing. You need a survey. And the buyer really should always get a new survey just to make sure everything is kosher. In terms of prorations, FARBAR prorates the tax assessment association fees, insurance, assumed rents, and other property taxes. NABOR prorates the taxes, the interest on assumed mortgages, rent, association assessments, the waste management fees, the appliance contracts, and the propane gas. Now, I wrote out the words from the contract on this slide, but they are essentially the same. Prorations are if the expense is incurred when the seller owned the property, the seller pays for it. If the expense is incurred when the buyer owned the property, the buyer pays for it, except, of course, in the case of special assessments, which you negotiate in the contract to determine who pays special assessments and when. It's interesting about the prorations. I'll say one last thing and then we'll open up to questions. Prorations is very easy. You take for example, for taxes, you take the total amount of the ad valorem taxes, you divide that by 365, take that number times the number of days in the year when the seller owned the property, and that's how much the seller owes a credit. So it's very easy to calculate prorations. Of course, nowadays the computer does it for us, so it's super easy. Michael, you're asking about propane. Yes, you would add propane to the FARBAR contract. If you're selling a property with like a generator or a propane tank for other reasons in it, you would prorate. You would want to add propane to the additional terms of the FARBAR contract. And with that, that is prorations and closing costs, and I will take any questions that anybody's got. Said today was going to be a short one. One-time capital contributions, Sherry, and the NABOR contract are paid by the buyer. Other questions anybody has got about closing costs or anything else we've covered in this series?
I have a question, Sam. There was a section you were reading about how the seller is to pay for all association documents. Can't remember what slide that was.
That's the name on NABOR, and now actually on FARBAR as well. On the FARBAR rider, the seller has to provide the association documents to the buyer. So the seller's got to go to the association, get the declaration, get the bylaws, get the articles, the documents, the MERS and SERS reports, and provide all that to the buyer.
What if the association doesn't answer? What if the association doesn't have it? Like the 2024 year-end financials and 2005 approved budget, for example. I'm in a situation right now that
Yep, so that's a great question. That happens a lot, Jessica, where the seller just can't get the documents or doesn't know what they're doing, and the buyer has a right to terminate all the way up to closing if they don't get the documents. So you
whether
could be sitting at the closing table, the buyer could say, "Hey, I never saw the budget for 2025 for this condominium. I'm walking from the table right now." And they get their deposit back.
even if it's an HOA.
Even if it's in an HOA. Well, the HOA, remember, we're getting into HOA condo disclosures, that's fine. But remember, in the HOA, you only have to provide the disclosure, not the actual documents, just the HOA disclosure summary form.
Unless you have that HOA
Unless you've got the
document
addendum to
review.
contract to provide the HOA documents.
Okay.
A couple other questions in the chat. Skip, all the fee, everything I discussed stays negotiable. Anybody can pay for anything if you negotiate it. Michael, closing costs, points are typically not closing costs. Those are lender fees. You could include points and have the sell. That's a great way for the buyer to get a better deal without lowering the purchase price, is have the seller pay points. And Deborah, yes, I will share the slides.
Hey, Sam.
Yes, Mike.
You also have available on the website the ability to do the preliminary closing costs for both the buyer and seller.
Yes, I do. Yes, you can go to saadlegal.com or paradisecoasttitle.com. Yep.
And that's helpful for people going into the to the process, whether they're buying or selling. And it's a great tool for the agents.
If you need a quick settlement statement, a net sheet for your seller, you can go to my websites, either one of them, and get in there and make a net sheet for the buyer or the seller, or you can email me or call me and I'll make you one with all the details. We get that turned around in about 20 minutes, 30 minutes. We do that pretty typically. Jessica, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, is there a cap of how much the seller can pay for buyer's closing costs? So I know with
And
loan,
lender transactions, yes, the closing costs and prepaids are determined by the loan product, and they can go anywhere from like 2 to 9%. So it just depends on the loan product. You got to talk to your lender about that.
so if it's a cash deal, there's no limit?
No limit. No, the seller can pay all the closing costs.
Okay.
Typically, closing costs are a little less than 1% per side. And lender fees are going to be another 1.5 to 2.5%. Association fees can be all over the place, but straight closing costs listed in the contract are going to be a little bit less than 1% per side.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Sam, could you clarify again what you said about the HOA? You said the disclosure is required, but do they not have to provide any documents,
No,
budgets,
Lori,
financials?
a homeowner association, different than a condo association. The homeowner association, you just have to provide the statutorily required summary page that NABOR has a form and it's attached to the FARBAR Rider B. But for condos, that's where you provide all those documents, just condos. HOAs is not required.
But if there's that HOA document review, I think it's
That's right.
That
The NABOR is
document,
an HOA document review addendum, and then you would provide all the same documents you provide for a condo for an HOA.
and then you have to have a HOA document receipt?
Then you have to have an HOA document receipt. That's correct, and that
And-
form is also provided by NABOR.
And how soon?
I believe it's 3 days to review the documents.
So after the 3 days, then if the 3 days are up and you didn't get the document review receipt, or does it
I
matter
don't
if
know, when you
get it on
deliver
the
the documents, you get the receipt, and that starts the 3-day clock for the buyer to review documents. So you give the buyer the HOA documents if you've
Mhm.
done the document review addendum,
Mhm.
and then you get the receipt from the buyer, and they have 3 days.
Okay.
Any other questions? You can put them in the chat as well. All right, everybody. Well, this is great. Thank you so much. I have one more series to go on, and one more in this series. Then we'll come up with some new videos. Look forward to seeing everybody on Thursday.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Sam.
Thanks. Bye.